Thanks for the beautiful intro, AJ, and the invitation to talk here, and thanks for all taking the interest and the time to come here on such a shitty day, I have to say. So I really appreciate that. I think that there's supposed to be a scheduled 45 minutes for me to talk and 10 minutes question time or something like that, but I'm really happy for these sorts of presentations to be more interactive. I think they just work better like that, and I get bored of my own voice after a while. So if you think of something or have a question that you want to put to me as we go, feel free to put up your hand and we'll address that as we go. If I'm going to address it later on in the talk, I'll just say just be patient, but otherwise questions always come up, so feel free to do so. We'll get into it. That's Des, just in, if you haven't met him, you might not have recognised him from the photo, but it's definitely Des in there. This is me, and this is the beginning of the talk. So the topics that I want to cover today, I'm not too sure, I haven't actually been through this talk, so I'm not too sure how long it takes, so just bear with me, and I'm not the world's best PowerPoint presentation talker. It's only the second time I've ever done one, so just forgive me if I'm a little clunky, but and if the slides don't sort of work seamlessly, but we'll see how that goes. But the topics today really are these ones here: history and information regarding deer in Australia, where do they come from, the impacts of deer currently and whether we should act or whether we should not, current actions that are being taken, what's the state of play in Australia and Victoria at the moment. We're going to talk about the CDMC, how we evolved and why we evolved and what we're all about. What the landowner options are if deer are a problem on your property, which is probably more a future talk about what you will be facing in the future rather than now, because I don't think that deer are a heavy problem here yet. We're going to talk a little bit about within the CDMC we had a number of roles, and research has been one of the most important parts of what we've done. So we'll talk a little bit about what we've done and how I think that now is probably the time that these areas should start thinking about research, because understanding what you've got is really important, because then you begin to understand what you lose. And in our area, we're sort of got a serious deer problem already, and we're doing our ground studies now to find out what's there, because we already know we've lost a lot, but we don't know what we've lost because we didn't have the base studies. So I'm saying you need to know these things. And then we're going to talk at the end about the current status of how things are on the peninsula, which is not an area of my expertise, and I'm hoping we've got someone from Parks here that might be able to talk on that, or at least help perhaps. But we'll see how that goes. So before I go any further, I'd just like you to watch a video. This video gives you an idea of what happens when things get out of balance in the environment, and I hope this works.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years, that the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds, of migratory birds, started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion, the channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
So it's obviously not entirely relatable to what's happening in Australia, but it really gives an indication of what happens when things get out of balance. And they're talking there a bit about a trophic cascade. We don't have exactly that here, but what we have is more like a reverse trophic cascade. What we've done is we've introduced the prey without the predator. And so the prey being the deer, there's nothing that will really attack them. The best we've got is either foxes or cats, and as you might see, they're no match for a deer. So deer haven't got anything that's going to knock them off here other than hunters, and hunters are hardly a natural prey. I won't talk more about that until a little bit later. Hunters are obviously a part of the solution to this problem, but they're not anything like a natural predator to these animals. So we'll talk a little bit about the history of deer in Australia. I won't go into it too much, but they were introduced first by the acclimatisation societies way back in the 1860s because people wanted to feel like Australia was home, and so they introduced species like blackbirds and rabbits and foxes and deer to try and feel at home, but also as a hunting resource because they liked hunting them and they thought, what could go wrong? So in all, over time, 17 species have been released in Australia, but only 6 really have survived. And we'll go into those a little bit more soon. Nothing really much happened for an awful long time. Deer were hanging around and basically just sitting in the environment, being fairly quiet. I do remember when we lived in Echuca, when we used to work there, we used to commute to Melbourne every now and then to see the relatives. And one day coming through Mickleham, this would be now 30 years ago, and seeing a deer by the side of the road as we were coming through Mickleham, thinking, oh, how cute's that? Little did I realise what I'd be doing about 30 years later, but yeah, they've just been sort of just in the shadows, really not really doing all that much and not causing much problems. They became a niche industry back in the mid-70s. They were very popular and deer numbers on farms grew quite a lot. But as with a lot of these industries, they didn't actually have a market for the product that they were producing, and so they built up their numbers and then it collapsed. And a lot of the farms went broke. There was no market for the product that they had. They couldn't feed them anymore, so they opened the gates and let them go. And so what happened in a lot of the cases in Victoria and I think in other areas of Australia was that the deer were released into the environment and they started to breed slowly. This was exacerbated because they became then a hunting resource, and hunters are very keen on deer. That's one of their favourite animals to hunt because they can be so elusive and it really puts them to the test. And they like that, but there weren't enough of them around and there weren't enough spots where they could do it. So unfortunately, hunters dispersed them across the state. This is still going on to this day. There's a farmer in South Australia that doesn't believe in deer control who's still dispersing them throughout that state, and there's no law to stop him from doing that. And yeah, the numbers stayed pretty low until I would say 20, 25 years ago. They really seemed to be pretty much under everyone's radar. As to why they've suddenly seemed to have exploded is really debatable, and I'd like to have a scientific discussion with someone about that. But my theory is that they've been very busy in the background eating out our environment, and the population in our area, in our bush, is now diminishing, and so they're now looking further afield to eat, and so they're now coming out onto private properties and onto farmland and onto our roads. That's my theory. Someone could prove me wrong. So the current status in Victoria, we have 6 species established in Victoria: fallow, sambar, red, rusa, hog and chital. By far the biggest damage is being done by fallow and sambar. It's hard to know who has the biggest numbers. The fallow deer are a lot smaller deer. I think personally that there are greater numbers of fallow, but the sambar are the ones I think are doing the most damage to the bush. They are browsers, whereas the fallow tend to be grazers. So fallow are happy on farmlands, the sambar stay in the bush and do an awful lot of damage. Back in 2017, when I first became interested in deer, I remember sitting in on a discussion and DELP was saying that they estimated that there were 1 million deer in Victoria at the time. In fact, I got interested in 2018 and they said back in 2017 there were 1 million deer at the time, and I thought at the time, oh, by now it's probably 1,200,000 deer. They're still using that figure today when you talk to, well, it's DECA now. When they talk about the number of deer in Victoria, they're still talking using this figure of 1 million. But if you multiply it out, deer increase in population by somewhere, in good circumstances, 30 to 35% per annum. So if you calculate that out now, you could be up to 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 million deer in the state now. Now, if you take off what hunters take out, we think that hunters take out approximately somewhere around about 100,000 to 130,000 deer a year. You're still probably going to end up with about 4 million deer in the state. So it's a heck of a lot. And it's one of the things that's the problem with deer is that we really don't know enough about them and where they are. Yes?
How does that compare to wild horses? I mean, wild horses are only, well, they're a bit more discreet, sort of in the mountains, but numbers?
I couldn't give you an idea of wild horses. I don't know. Yeah, I really don't know. Outside my area of expertise, I'm sorry. In Victoria, deer are called protected wildlife. So they're actually put on a status with kangaroos and wombats and koalas and things that it's illegal to shoot them without a licence, although, believe it or not, back in 2016, the Governor in Council, there was a Governor in Council order because the Victorian government at the time realised that deer were becoming an increasing problem on farmlands specifically. They decided to use a really weird term called unprotection. And so on private property, deer are unprotected nowadays. And you'll find out throughout this talk there are whole lots of little either anachronisms or contradictions in what the government says and what the government does. So the government are very keen to do something about deer, but they unprotect them, but they're a protected status. So you'll see these contradictions as we talk through. So they're unprotected on private land, which basically means that if you have deer on your property and they are causing damage, you are allowed to cull them on your property without seeking a permit. Except for hog deer, unfortunately. And as I say, deer are yet to be declared a pest in Victoria. So Victoria is the only mainland state where deer are not yet declared a pest. Tasmania still haven't done it. I'm sure it's just around the corner, but they're just taking an awful long time to get there. And in Victoria, the two most common deer species are fallow and sambar. I believe that the ones that are now on the peninsula that have been sighted are fallow. I don't think that sambar have been sighted, well, not on the peninsula itself, on the islands. I think that we've got sambar on one of the islands. Fallow are much lighter deer. This is the Bambi deer. So this is what the one everyone sort of looks at and thinks that's really cute. They're grazers mainly. You can read all of that information there. They tend to move in herds. They're not quite as private. The sambar deer are very big, like 350 kilograms is the size of a Jersey cow. They tend to stick in the forest a lot more. They're browsers. It's my belief that they do a lot more damage to the natural environment than fallow do, but I don't have proof on that. They're a bit scary when you come across them at night time if you're walking anywhere near the bush, because all of a sudden you're just walking along minding your own business. This incredibly loud honk will come at you and you'll jump out of your skin. That'll be a sambar. They're the ones you don't want to hit on the roads. In fact, you don't want to hit either of them on the roads. And the distribution in Victoria. Now this is a little bit old, this map, and you'll see on the right hand side the distribution over time, and you'll see that that map is a little bit out of date, but you'll see there's a couple of times there where the numbers of deer jump in Victoria. The records only started in 1930, but as you watch now you'll see how these numbers change, and you'll see how they suddenly appear in the middle of nowhere. And especially in bushy areas like the dark green areas are forest areas, that's most likely hunters moving them around. It gets scary soon. So that's how, if you see the past decade, past 2 decades, the numbers have really radically and rapidly increased, and their spread has increased as well. So, sorry, I should say before we go on, it's a really scary map, I think, to see how their numbers are increasing, and to me it means it's obvious that if you want to save your environment, we have to do something to stop that, even if it's in local areas. The really scary thing, I think, the frightening thing, is the next map, which we come to, because deer haven't yet reached, in most deer, haven't yet reached their preferred habitat in Australia. And if you have a look at the next map, it tells you the little red dots that you'll see in there are where deer currently are. The dark black areas are where they would prefer to be.
Mike?
Yep.
What timescale was that over that little animation?
The first map where the numbers were appearing?
Yeah.
Started in 1930, and it's every year after that. That's when records started. So you can see fallow deer are relatively happy in their environment where they would like to be, but they would obviously like to spread further. Sambar deer, which are the most damaging, I think, in our state, haven't reached their preferred habitat yet. And you can imagine how bad it's going to be when they get up into the wet tropics up north. That's would be their favourite habitat. So just some of the things that have been said about deer, just off the cuff. I was just thinking about this, that you get people who are pro and people who are against deer. So they've been likened by the Centre for Invasive Species Solutions to the vertebrate cane toad. In their opinion, they're as bad, and they think that the risk to our environment is as bad as a cane toad. The Invasive Species Council think that deer are probably Australia's worst emerging pest animal problem. They have been listed in Victoria as a threatening process, so Samba have been listed as a threatening process. And on the other hand, the government has classed deer as a protected species, despite all of that. The Game Management Authority in Victoria has decided that deer are a valuable hunting resource and so need to be protected as such. And Bambi are cute. And I don't deny, Bambi are really, they're a beautiful animal. They just they shouldn't be here. So the question is, should we do something about them or should we not? And the case for, and it's a really important point, but if you're ever going to discuss this, and the CDMC decided, Cardinia Deer Management Coalition, just to remind, way at the very beginning, that if we're to try and encourage our community to try and do something about deer, that we need to embrace all opinions. And so these opinions are all out there, and if you can't mount a successful argument against opinions people are giving you, then there's a problem. So we need to understand why people don't want to cull deer in order to explain why we think it's important. And these are all fair enough. It's not deer's fault that they're here. Every animal has a right to life. Control is inhumane. That's a debatable thing, but that's what a lot of people think. Some people don't think deer really do any damage. A lot of people think Bambis are cute. A lot of people, and especially the hunters, think it's a waste to kill something without actually utilising it. It's too late to eradicate them, so we may as well just learn to live with them. And they're a quality hunting resource. And obviously, as I said, there are some conundrums in here. You can't say on the one hand they're a quality hunting resource and on the other hand say control is inhumane. So you'll get these sort of contradictions as we go. Talking of the control is inhumane, I'll just quickly address that. Every animal dies of something at some stage. Most deer will die of either they will have lost their teeth or they'll get cancer or whatever. Death in the wild is never nice, rarely nice. And I would say, I think it's quite arguable that a bullet that will kill you within seconds is probably nicer than starving to death over a period of weeks. But that's a debate. Or should we act? So the four primary concerns about deer are their environmental damage, private property incursion, agricultural impact and road trauma. We'll talk about those. These areas here, this is not far from where we live, and I wouldn't be surprised if you've got some fern gullies somewhere around here. Would that be right? So just take pictures of them right now, and if deer get in this area, then retake them in years to come, because this is a healthy fern gully at the top, and this is one that now has deer in there, and deer will destroy every one of these ferns. They love killing fern, they love rubbing on them, and you can see rubbing marks on a couple of them there, and destroying them. Anyway, moving on to the environmental damage. So what they do, they've got selective herbivory, so they go through the bush and they don't like eating everything, but they do like certain plants, and they will kill certain plants. For example, in our area, they love coprosma. Actually, where's Michelle? So maybe deer are going to be a valuable asset here because they'll knock off your caramoo. Yeah. So, but I'm just saying that they are quite selective, and in our area, probably to go back a step, Amanda said originally that I got into this for environmental concerns. The actual specific reason why I got into deer was a meeting I went to back in early in 2018. The helmeted honeyeater recovery team were having a meeting there and talking about one of the areas near where I live, just in the valley below me, is a very favoured site for the potential release of helmeted honeyeater. They're trying to disperse them further so that they've got multiple sites within Victoria, so that if one gets burnt out, they won't be wiped out again. And they had a really good meeting, and they said, this is a really good site, it's got the perfect this and the perfect that, and it's just wide enough, and we can protect it. It was all really good. And at the end of the meeting they said, so we need to do another botanical survey because we're concerned about the amount of damage that deer are doing to the understory. And that was the first really major thought in my mind. I said, that much damage, really? And over the next couple of weeks, as I was talking to both members of the conservation group that I'm a member of and local community, I just heard more and more people talking about deer. And I thought, we probably should do something about that. Competition for feed.
Michael?
Yes.
You've indicated there that rubbing is particular with mature sassafras.
Yep.
Rightly or wrongly, you might assume that rubbing is as a result of some biting insect on the deer. Why do you think they pick on sassafras? Why not anything?
Well, it's not because of that they rub. They rub because they're scent marking. So, two reasons. One is scent marking. The other is that when their antlers have got their felt on them, it's quite irritating to them, and so they want to get that felt off. And so they'll actually rub their antlers on the trees. But they prefer, you can only ask a deer this question, but they have certain species that they love. And in our area, sassafras is obviously one of them, muttonwood is the other. And muttonwood is one of the vital resources for the helmeted honeyeater. And that's why it's such a risk to our area. So there are certain species that they love and certain that they won't touch. And, you can have, they love, for example, they love veggie gardens. But they also love coprosma, which are prickly little buggers. And you wonder why they would want that. So it's not as easy as sort of thinking they like something lush and they love what they love. Okay, so competition for feed, yes. So they're competing with the likes of kangaroos and wallabies and wombats and things for feed. They're also eating out, I guess, the understory so that the little birds that feed on the understory can't feed there on those plants anymore. They leave trails and wallows and erosion. Rubbing, as we were just talking about before, and along with the trails is the spreading of weeds. So this is about 3 years ago, the Peri-Urban Weed Management Project contacted the CDMC. And I kind of thought, where's this coming from? But the reason why they contacted us was because they perceived that deer were one of the major weed spreaders in our area. And if we couldn't control deer, then we couldn't control weeds. Water quality, well, you can see the quality of water that's going to be coming out of those. This is a reason why Melbourne Water are becoming very passionate about deer control now. Deer are what are known as habitat modifiers. There's a lot of them around, but if you have a habitat modifier in a habitat which is not typical for them, then the impact that they're going to have is going to be really severe. For example, they live in the same area that another habitat modifier lives. The lyrebird's a habitat modifier, but the lyrebird has lived there for eons, but deer have not, and the damage that they're doing is changing our habitat in front of us. And the other thing that you'll notice, land care groups in our area have had sometimes up to 100% of their plantings destroyed overnight by deer. So they've spent all that day planting something out, they've got there and the next day they've gone and they've just been destroyed. And I have a video, I haven't got it here today, but I have a video someone took of deer walking through a land care planting, and they're just walking along and just picking off the plastic covers that are protecting the plants. Just like vandals, like little willful vandals, just dipping off and just moving, not eating them, but just picking off because it's a game. Okay, moving on. Private property incursion. So it's probably, I mean, I wish that it was that everyone was passionate about the environment like me and that's why they wanted to control deer, but it's not the case. Most people don't care. But when they get onto their private property, then they do care. And this, well, you can see that the Samba deer is somewhere in Doncaster. They're actually getting further and further into the urban environment, and I understand from Chris Hardham just told me a minute ago about a deer footage on the news that was in Toorak?
No, East Kew.
In East Kew? Yeah, jumped out of the bush somewhere and into someone's garden and smashed their pool fence or something like that. So these will become more and more common. But I know that Manningham Council and Nillumbik Council are very worried about deer and their encroachment into their suburban areas. This is and actually those two councils were probably one of the major movers and shakers back in the about 2016-17. They started off a couple of groups there, which have been really good at encouraging activity on deer.
When you get into those urban areas, surely they need a bit of
Bush.
they can't just survive just in a really urbanised sort of area.
Yep.
Do they need a bit of a more natural area to keep them in?
Yeah, they do. So they won't exist without. They're not like foxes. Foxes are really happy in the urban environment, but deer will need to have somewhere to shelter. But come this time of year, which is when they're beginning their mating season, they'll travel quite far and wide to find something else. There are, within our green areas, so Warrandyte and the like, which get quite into the urban areas, there are corridors that go along. And when Michelle was talking about the corridor going from Mount Martha to Greens Bush, I think that's really super duper. You know, we all need more of those. But deer are one of our major threats to these sorts of corridors, and they'll use them to move. So it's one of the things why we'll talk about later what I would encourage you to do. But yeah, there's a real problem, and obviously those suburban incursions are quite a problem. But they're not natural in the suburbs either. So that was in Halliburton in Canada, but you know, that might happen one day here too. Who knows? That blows me away, that one. So their agricultural input. Well, I don't think you don't have any vineyards on the peninsula, do you? It also wouldn't be a risk. Yeah, so we won't worry about that. They compete with stock. They cause infrastructure and fence damage. So deer are persistent. You know, you sort of think you could put up this little fence and it'll be okay if as long as it's tall enough. But they really will work hard to get where they want to go. If they know there's some quality food on the other side of the fence, they'll work hard at it, and they'll damage fences just to get there. And when you put up a fence to try and keep them out, it has to be very good, not just a little bit of wire here and there. The cost of exclusion, these fences are 3 or 4 times the normal cost of a fence that you would put in for a farm. They're biosecurity risk. So currently we don't have an issue of biosecurity with deer, but if diseases like foot and mouth, Shura, TB, there's a number of them, screwworm fly, were to come into Australia, then deer would be a natural habitat, a natural resource for those diseases, and a natural, what do they call it, what's the word for it? Yeah, it's just a resident population, I can't remember, yeah. So the time and financial cost of getting rid of them is obviously substantial, and the psychological impact. I put that one in because I was at a conference, must have been in 2017-18, the New South Wales Vertebrate Pest Management Symposium. And they had all these scientific experts there telling about monitoring of deer and how to control this and how to do that and how to get community involvement. It was really a very good conference. But one of the things that really stuck with me, that was a guy called Ted Rowley, who's a New South Wales farmer. And he came up, he's just such a salt of the earth guy, just a really average bloke that you talk to on the side of the street. And he started to talk about his experience as a farmer with deer. And he said that nowadays when he comes, and he had a tear in his eye as he was talking about this, his wife was up on the stage with him. He says nowadays when he comes home from shopping with his wife goes inside with the groceries and makes a cup of tea, and he goes out and gets his gun, hops into the ute and shoots deer. That's what it's like for him. That's why I talk about the psychological impact. Just recently, if you're interested about that, the actual financial cost, counting the doe, is a report put out by Frontier Economics. It was commissioned by the Invasive Species Council. And the cost to agriculture in Victoria alone is expected to be somewhere between 1.5 and 2.2 billion over the next 10 years. That's just in Victoria alone. And that doesn't include environmental cost. It only includes agricultural cost. Okay? So if you do include environmental costs, it will multiply that out 10 times over, I would say. Not that governments ever really try to put a value on our environment, but we know how important the environment is. We don't exist without it. Road trauma. So road trauma's an ever increasing problem. And in our area, it's common. You know, we'll have probably 7 or 8 cars written off every year on our local roads, and that number's going up every year. They had it's 10 years ago now, the first road fatality was in Australia with deer was in New South Wales. I mean, I hope it doesn't happen again, but the logic tells you that it probably will. The repair costs on average, if a kangaroo hits your car, is about $3,000. If a deer hits your car, it's about $20,000. So you're talking about almost every time it's going to be a write-off. This is also an area. This is up near Sassafras. And if you look at the white colour of that deer there, the colour of sandbar is incredibly variable. You'll get some that are almost black and some that are almost white. It's quite common. But people think it's really special when they see a white one, but it's really not all that uncommon. And okay, so the question is why I'm here today, I guess, is to explain. Oh, look, I've got a little pointer here, isn't this magic? It'll be one of these buttons, that one. Yeah. So where I live, I live in Upper Beaconsfield, which is in the foothills of the Dandenongs. We started out as a group in the Cardinia catchment. And we didn't know how many deer we had when we first started. We just knew that it was obvious it was a problem. But we now calculate that we're somewhere in this area here. And we're struggling to try and keep our numbers down locally. It's really difficult. In fact, we're not succeeding yet. And I wish we were, but the numbers are still expanding. Where you are here, I'm guessing is somewhere around about here. You've got deer in this area, but you haven't got all that many of them. But what this gives you is an indication of the relative value of spending money on deer control is. And if you look at the bottom here, let's get that button again, wherever it was. This here, if you can prevent deer from getting in your area, you know, you get a 100 to 1 return on your investment. You know, it's a really good return on investment. If you've got them in your area and you have to try and get them out, then you're talking about a 1 to 25 returns. So it's about a quarter as good or 4 times more expensive to try and now to control them than it was to stop them from getting here in the first place. Where we are now in our area, we've got this where we're somewhere between 10 and 20 times worse, more expensive for us to try and get rid of deer out of our area. And really we're talking here not about eradication, which would be really nice, but about containment. So our goal is to try and keep them at a number where they're not causing too much damage, whatever that means, to the environment. And obviously as it goes on and the deer numbers increase, then you get into this area here where you're really talking about asset-based protection. You know, you're not going to contain them anymore, you're just trying to protect various areas. So there might be a plot of land where you're trying to protect them and keep them out of. So this is why the talk today, I think, is really important, because you're here and it's a pretty good time to sort of start getting your act into gear and start to do something about deer control. So what's being done? Because deer haven't been a big thing in this area, you may not be aware of just how much is happening in the world around us at the moment, but it's a lot. For years and years and years, up until about the early 2000s, not really much has happened. But in no particular order, councils, federal and state government have all now started to make policies. Most councils have got a deer policy, including Mornington, but I'm not too sure about. Yeah, I don't know locally what your council is doing. Landowners, well, obviously they've been involved, especially the ones in the most hard-hit areas. And the most hard-hit areas obviously near state parks, because state parks are a harbour for deer, unfortunately. And a lot of people really get upset with DECA and with Parks Vic that they're not doing enough. But I can tell you, the workers in Parks Vic and DECA would love to do more, but there's always a funding problem. They just don't have money to do what they need to do, and they never will have the money to do what they do because governments will never give it to them because there's always another election to be won. So it's just a statement of fact that this is one of the things that the community has to get involved with. Community groups and land care. Obviously land care are pretty hard hit where deer are a problem, so that's why they're getting involved. CDMC is one of the community groups, obviously. Invasive Species Council, Centre for Invasive Species. So Invasive Species Council has just put on a deer project control officer, I think is the correct term. Yep. Peter Jacobs. Centre for Invasive Species, so that's Victoria, Invasive Species Council. Peter Jacobs is a Victoria position. Centre for Invasive Species Solutions has just put on a national deer coordinator because they consider it such a serious problem. If you remember early on, they were the one that described them as the vertebrate cane toad. Parks Victoria are now doing culling operations, and I believe Devil Bend has got a culling operation working through SSAA at the moment. Is that correct? Yep. So Parks Vic are doing it. Melbourne Water have just changed their attitude towards deer control. It used to be managing deer on their properties, and recently, after a little bit of pressure, they decided to change it from managing to eradicating deer on some of their properties. So that's a really big step. That's the first government entity to have taken that step, which is really pleasing. And DECA have come up with, they're coordinating the funding now for some of the deer management projects around the state. And recreational shooters and farmer assist have been involved basically from the word go. And of course there's the Victorian Deer Control Community Network, and if anyone wants to have a chat about that, Johannes is your man, he'll fill you in. But this network here, we thought was important because, you know, as we're sort of going and talking to people, we're finding out, oh, we're trying this and they're trying that, and we're thinking, but they've already done that, and why are you doing that? Because someone has already established that doesn't work, or there just wasn't any communication between the various groups within the state as to what needed to be done. And so Johannes and I had a chat one day about, you know, we need to get this information together, and Johannes, it was one of the biggest mistakes I made as the president of the Cardinia Deer Management Coalition. I said, Johannes, you go with it. And I haven't seen him since. He's been so busy, and they've got 160 groups now that are involved with the VDCCN. The collaboration is fantastic. The resources that are appearing within their website is awesome. I know that the main Creek Catchment Land Care Network is also an affiliate member of that, which is really good. You'll get a lot of information out of them. So what's being done in a timeline? So yeah, as I say, it's been a slow progress. It started way back then, mid-70s, there was a boom industry, then the collapse of the industry, and it just starts to ramp up from here. The Deer Forum with Manningham, Nillumbik and Rara Ranges started back then, and it just gets added to, because you can see these are all recent things. It's just getting faster and faster as this damage that's being done by deer is being recognised by more and more people, and more things are being done about it. I need a drink. Is that for me?
Yes, it's you.
Beautiful. Is there any questions for anything that I've said so far? Yes?
I just wonder, there was recently an example of deer, male deer at a certain times of the year get very ferocious.
Yep.
In that case, they killed a person.
Yep.
But that was enclosed. But
Yes.
In the wild, even if it's the wrong time of the year for the big deer,
Mhm.
they're liable to attack it anywhere or not?
Would be extremely rare. It can happen, and it has happened, but it's extremely rare. So I wouldn't put it out as a major threat. But they do, as their mating season is the most likely time when they're going to be doing that, because they become highly aggressive then. But really, deer, a little bit like snakes, they'd rather run away from you than run towards you. And unless you corner them, like they almost did in the shop, where they're trying to escape, more likely they're going to run away from you.
Can I just add a bit to that? That gentleman that got killed from the deer did everything wrong he could possibly do. It could have been a horse, it could have been a bull, it could have been anything. He did totally the wrong thing, and he got what he was looking for. So, I mean, there is a way to handle deer, a way to handle any sort of animal, and he did exactly the wrong thing.
Yeah. Oh,
They give you plenty of warnings that they're upset, so...
yeah. Yes.
Why did they establish deer farms in the 1970s?
Why did they? Because they wanted to sell the meat and the felt. So the Chinese felt market was probably one of the biggest drivers for that, because for them it's an aphrodisiac product. So they just bred up because they thought this market was going to be insatiable, but it wasn't. And so it happens in a lot of industries where they build up these big numbers because they think there's a big market and find out it's not there. Yes, just continue.
Can you buy venison at a butcher?
Yes, you can. Yeah. Yeah.
One solution would be to publicise that and get more people to go out and supply the butchers.
Yeah, look, it's. I think it's. Yeah, it's a discussion we'll have a little bit later potentially, but it's very difficult for hunters to get their meat into the market. It's very difficult. Most of the meat that comes into supermarkets will come from dedicated deer farms. Yes.
How is the gourmet venison market supplied?
From deer farms. Almost exclusively from deer farms, but there are a number of wild deer harvesters nowadays. This is a relatively new thing in Victoria. It's been going for New South Wales for a while, but in Victoria there are now dedicated harvesters. It's very difficult to get the licence. It has to be a dedicated deer facility that does the work. The hunters that do it have to be specially registered to do the work. And you're not going to find that it's going to be possible in a semi-rural area, because in order for those companies to succeed on any given night, they need to get a minimum of about 7 deer in one hit. And most properties around here, you won't get 7 deer in one hit. You might get 7 over, 4 or 5 properties, but that makes it commercially unfeasible. Yes?
I understand legislation is notoriously slow to be updated. It does baffle me that they're listed as a protected species under the Wildlife Act ahead of some of the native species. Are you aware of any moves to make amendments to the Act or anything like that? Or?
No, I don't think there's any moves, but there's a lot of pressure. There's pressure coming from everywhere except for the hunting lobby. So the hunting lobby have had the ear of government for quite a while. And I don't, sometimes it sounds when I'm talking as though I've got something against hunters. I don't. The hunting lobby is different to the hunters. And most people, who, for example, who are SSAA or ADA members, do it because they want the insurance. They don't want it because they actually believe in what those organisations do. So there's been a strong lobbying. And to be honest, deer hunting is very popular in Victoria, and the hunting lobby would like the national parks to be opened up more to deer hunting because they feel that they can do something to solve the problem. I won't go much into that because I know that I'm running out of time, but it's unlikely that they'll go very close to solving the problem in those national parks. Just one last question before I move on. Yep.
Just continuing with deer hunting. In terms of eating wild deer,
Yep.
what health restrictions are implemented to ensure that they're not full of parasites and damaging to people?
There's very few parasites in deer in Australia. In Europe and America there are, but in Australia it's not a problem. They have done some research into deer a while ago, and they found as far as the meat goes, it's extremely healthy. So at this stage, it's not a risk. But hunters aren't allowed to sell their meat. They used to not even be able to give it away, but that has been relaxed, so they can now give it away. And the onus is then on the person that gets given the meat. You should know, if you go to a hunter and say, I would like some deer meat, and they give it to you, that it's then your onus. You take the risk. And so you do your own research as to whether you're happy with that. Make sure you cook it properly, that sort of stuff. Rightio, we'll move on. Oops. And did I finish off that last bit? Oh yeah, okay, sorry. So we formed back, this is how we formed. So this poster on the right-hand side was our first ever community deer meeting when I was sort of wondering whether our local community was interested in doing anything. And normally locally, if we get 10 or 12 people to a meeting, we're pretty happy about it. We ran out of room. We had 90 people in the room. And there's obviously a huge amount of interest in and concern about deer. So we started the group. We were fortunate enough to get some pro bono legal advice very early on from a friend of mine who just happened to be a local solicitor who in his youth had been a professional roo shooter. And so he had these expertise that just meshed so nicely. So it's a really difficult area to be involved in because if you're trying to talk about deer control, you're talking about these very lethal weapons. They're very powerful weapons. You've got to be very careful, and so we needed to take our steps very carefully. We started our matchmaking. So this is trying to match farmers with responsible controllers. We call it matchmaking because we're not a hunter group. We're actually an environment group, so we didn't want to get involved with hunting, but we did want to try and make it safe as possible, as humane as possible, and as effective as possible. So that's why our group sort of got involved, is to try and achieve those goals. We got a federal government grant back in 2020, which just blew us out of the water. All of a sudden, now we had $20,000 and had a little idea what to do with it, but we had said on the grant application we wanted to do an aerial survey to find out how many deer we had. And at the same time we were waiting for that grant to come in, Melbourne Water came up with a grant opportunity, so we applied for that as well for an aerial survey. And within a month of each other, we got them both. And so we had too much money to deal with, so the Melbourne Water grant we turned into a vegetation survey, and so we did both of those over the coming years. Joined Landcare in 2021, that was mainly for insurance purposes. Affiliated with the Western Port Catchment Landcare Network in 2021. The Victorian Deer Control, so we were involved strongly with the establishment of VDCCN. We've just applied for a peri-urban deer control grant this year, and we're hopeful that we might get that. So hopefully we might get another $30,000. We're quietly confident, we'll see. And I was invited to speak to the Main Creek Landcare, and this is the highlight of the, I mean, what can I say? But I think I may as well stop right now. And how we operate. So as I say, we're an environment group, not a hunter group. Our mission is to connect community to protect biodiversity through humane deer reduction. And as I said before, we do more like matchmaking. We don't actually follow hunters out on the ground. Once a landowner has said, yes, we like that controller, then we leave that deal between the landowner and the controller. We keep a track on it, we get asked for feedback, and if we're not happy with what a controller's doing, we just won't use them again. We support our landowners in what they're doing. We do advocacy work. So this down here in the bottom here is advocacy work. That, I don't know if you recognise this little guy on here on the left. That's James Merlino. When he was the Deputy Premier, so we went and had a chat with him. Research work. So on the left here, down the bottom, that's Dr. Amy Bennett, who is the originator of a new deer survey, a vegetation impact deer survey. So there she is inducting us into the use of that survey technique. And the one on the top here is the Speaker's Corner. That's the Bunyip show where we were asked to present at the Bunyip show. So that's me having a chat with the local people. So education is a really important thing, and research is a very important thing to us, because you can't know whether you're achieving your goals if you don't know what you've got. And so we figure that it's really important we understand what's happening around us. So for the landowners, what can you do living with deer? I've been told that I've got to wind up, so I'm just moving on pretty quickly here. I did talk before about fencing your property, 2 metres high, very expensive. Some of the vineyards are doing it because they have to, because it's the only thing that they can do. You can try and minimise it so you're only doing fencing at risk areas. Just remember that deer are very persistent. If they know, if they've been to your lemon tree the year before, they'll want to get back there the next year. So if you put something around, it has to be substantial. And tree guards, they need to be strong and tall. There are sonic and strobe light deterrents. They're quite effective for about 2 or 3 months, and then they acclimatise and they just ignore them. The same with scent deterrents, not effective for a long period of time, and you've got to keep on putting them back there every time it rains. You can avoid planting tasty plants, so no rosies or veggies in your veggie garden. Not really a very practical solution, and it's not very desirable, but they do have their favourite plants and you can avoid them. Wolves, great option, but maybe not. But big dogs are highly effective. So if you have a big dog in your backyard, a maremma or something like that, if you've got alpacas and you've got a maremma, then it's probably going to be very effective at keeping deer out. And as I say at the very bottom, unfortunately, none of these address the root problem, which is the deer in your environment. All they do is they just move it somewhere else. So someone else will have the problem that you've tried to stop at your place. And controlling deer. So the only effective mechanism at the moment is shooting. Deer are now unprotected on private property, as I said before. There is a big difference between hunting and controlling. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the ethical issues are really significant and need to be addressed, and this is an ongoing problem for us. It has to be humane. We try to minimise waste where we can, although it's interesting that deer are treated by hunters very differently to just about every other species. So if they hunt pigs or rabbits or foxes, they don't care about waste, but when it comes to deer, it's suddenly something that can't be tolerated. So I get it that it's really, if we can utilise the deer meat, we should do so. But it tends to be a roadblock to us, because if they can't get rid of the meat, they stop shooting, and that's a problem for us because we think that the environment is more important than having someone to give the meat to. But that's just an ongoing ethical debate that we're having. Unfortunately, not all properties are safe from shooting. In fact, most aren't. The topography of your property is really vital. You need to have a valley or a backdrop that you can shoot into, because these bullets will travel for 5 kilometres if you're not careful what you do with them, and they'll ricochet if you're not careful. So most properties you can't cull deer on. But if you work with your neighbour, you might find that between the two properties there's a valley and you can shoot that way. So working with your neighbours can be highly effective at increasing, and so rather than not being able to shoot on either property or property B, but you can shoot on property A and B. Illegal shooting is a constant problem. I don't know. Does anyone know whether you have illegal shooting down here on the peninsula? I'm guessing you probably would, but don't know. Yeah. I see a nod in the background. It's a problem because that's dangerous shooting. They often shoot from the side of the road. They really don't know their area very well. They go there just by happenstance. They think there might be a deer there. They'll shoot it. And we've had a number of stock that have been killed by illegal shooting. Yes.
Would it be a solution for landholders to have to employ a professional shooter rather than going out themselves? If that was made law, then there would be more control over the humaneness and the method of shooting. Because at the moment, for example, with kangaroos, virtually anyone can apply for a permit to shoot on their property.
Yeah.
And I personally know the case where somebody handed the gun to a 12-year-old son to take pot shots, and that you don't have that control. So if it could be, only that they had to employ a professional shooter.
Look, it's a really good point, and if there was enough money in the world, it would probably be a good solution. But the money's got to come from somewhere. Professional shooters are expensive. And when you start getting down to the stage where there are not a lot of deer around, private landowners aren't going to want to do that anymore, because they'll spend $300 for a night of shooting and get nothing. So at that stage, you're probably going to need to have volunteer shooters continue on. So I'm not anti-professionals at all. I wish them all the best, and I hope that the government funds more and more of them. But there's two things I'd say, or one thing I'd say about that, is that because you're a professional doesn't mean you're good, and because you're a volunteer doesn't mean you're bad. And the people that we've got working for us in our group, we've vetted them all. They're extremely good. We've got one guy who's been on a property for now 4 months now, and he's taken 28 deer off that property, and he's been active in our area. People don't even know he's coming or going. I mean, he phones them to let him know that they're there, but he's very quiet because it's in their best interest. So my thoughts are that if we want to control this problem, there's never going to be enough money put there by government or by landowners to do it. We need to work with volunteer shooters. We need to train the volunteer shooters to be good. We need to give them experience. So one of the things that our group does is they actually mentor hunters that want to get into this space. And so they'll go out with our guys and learn how to do it, how to be safe, that sort of stuff. So what you're saying is really important. Yeah. Yeah.
You're targeting and talking about the landholders, the farmers and so on, and you've mentioned Melbourne Water being involved. But what happens with the public land like it's controlled by Parks Victoria and, well, council land like the Briars here on the Mornington Peninsula? I know for a fact we used to live in McElroy's Road. There's a small reserve called Pengeron. I've got a photograph on my phone which was taken 2.5 years ago of 2 Bambi deer. And they're obviously around an area that's controlled by Parks Victoria that I don't think Parks Victoria even know exists.
Yep. Yep.
You know, it's in the centre of a large private land area.
Yep.
But it's obviously a reservoir or an area where deer are living.
Yeah. Okay, so the answer to your question is Melbourne Water are actually more moneyed up than most, and so they have the money to do control. And on, say for example, one of the nearest properties of theirs to us, Cardinia Reservoir, they've taken out over 200, almost 300 deer in the past few months there. Parks Victoria have instigated a culling program in the land just along the creek near where I live. So there's a little park right next door to me, and also further down. They've been doing culling in the past few months, and they've taken out, I don't know what the numbers are, but I would be surprised if any more than 10. So Parks Vic work with Melbourne Water. They're moneyed up. They use professional shooters, and they hit them hard. Parks Vic use SSAA, and it's very expensive for Parks Vic because very few of their land masses are completely fenced, which means that they've got to have a person on every gate that goes in. This is an employee to make sure that any passers-by just don't want to stumble into this area. So it costs Parks Vic, in my calculation, somewhere between $1,000 to $2,000 per deer to cull deer in their property. And the amount that we're costing to do what we're doing is probably $20 or $30 per deer. So if you can see the difference with where the money goes. As for councils are too risk averse. So we are struggling really, I can only talk about our local council, Cardinia. We've been in consultation with them for a long time, and they are saying, yes, we would love to, yep, we want to do this and that. But they haven't got anywhere yet, despite all of this talk, because usually their risk management team will block them. So if you can get your councils to change their attitude and show them a better way, like we're in the process of trying to do that, and we're trying to we've identified one of their properties where we think we can do it, and we can demonstrate to them that it can be safe. But they're like private properties. If you've got a small block of land with deer on it, they'll struggle to control them there because it would probably be too dangerous. Rightio, moving on. Permission to destroy form. Yeah, okay, I think we'll just move on from there. So this is... Yep. That's okay.
Has there been any sort of work done on whether deer can be habituated to like a food source to poison them? So like what the kind of stuff they've been doing with pigs and habituating them to a thing, and then on one day they're poisoned.
Yes.
They're habituated to the
Yes, there is. So they call them aggregators, and there's been work done in South Australia about deer aggregators, and they're just about to market them nationally. They're not declared legal in Victoria yet, and I suspect there's going to be a process to go through. But what they do is they encourage deer to come into an area. Only deer can get into these feeders because they've got various types of excluders that stop roos and wombats and possums and birds from getting in. But they encourage deer to come in. And then the question is, what do you do next? There are two alternatives. You can either then swap the normal food for a poison food, or you can put them in an area where it encourages deer to come where they're easier to be culled. So these are emerging technologies. Yep. So culling and hunting. So just very quickly, it's really important. Lots of properties have got a hunter, but just because you've got a hunter doesn't mean you're going to be effective. And we find hunters on average in our area are a block because they go there once or twice a year, they take out a deer, whereas really if you're culling, you'd want to be taking out 20 or 30 deer in a year. And so they're actually slowing. I won't say this is the case for all hunters. Some of them are really good. We do have some local hunters who are very good. But in a lot of cases, they just want some meat every now and then. And so the property owner will get them on and they say, I've got a hunter. But they haven't got a colour. And that's really where it needs to be. This is obviously not of great relevance to you here at this stage because you're not at this stage, but down the track, these are your differences. With culling, it's a job. It's not a pleasure. They have specific goals, whereas with hunting, it's no defined goal. With culling, you want these multiple deers. You want to prioritise females because it's 5 times more effective to take females out than to take males out if you're trying to decrease the population. You want frequent visits. You want to maximise your efficiency, whereas hunters, for them, it's about fair chase. They want to feel like it's, I don't know how to put it politely, but like it's a game, and the deer have a chance. And so with hunting, you don't use spotlights, you don't use thermal equipment. It's really a one-on-one sort of thing. With culling, you can use thermal equipment, whereas you can't with hunting. And with culling, you can hunt overnight. And this use of thermal equipment here, which we've got at the bottom, I don't know if I need to use the pointer, but that's a game changer. That's an absolute game changer. Their ability to cull deer with thermal equipment is just multiple times greater. So your effective do's and don'ts of culling, I think we might skim through that. Multiple animals. I think I've basically covered most of that. Some big properties might need 2 or 3 controllers. Communication is really important throughout your area because you don't want to surprise people. You don't want to surprise your neighbours that all of a sudden this is happening. You need to be open about it and keep your good hours because the last thing you want is for your neighbours to start getting upset and telling you to stop culling. So it's ideal to have hunters stop around about 10 o'clock at night, otherwise people start to get upset, and not to just shoot up the place, obviously. And our bottlenecks, I talked about this a bit before, carcass control. So there's all these carcasses around, what do you do with them? We would like a better solution. That's a real difficult one for us, but that's something we're working at. We can't give incentives for hunters because if we give hunters incentives, then they stop being volunteers and they start being classed by their insurance company as professionals, and that voids their insurance policy. So we would love to be able to incentivise, but we can't do that legally. Funding for lethal control, which obviously has to be done through professionals. There's just never enough of it. And all of the grants that we apply for have a specific thing. We would like you to control these feral animals, but we don't want you to kill them. It's kind of how it's worded. And you thought, well, what do you want? Property access. So in our area, we just need to get onto more and more properties because it's so widespread. Trophy hunters, they're no good to us. Lots and lots of deer on your property, but no safe shot. So that's what this working with neighbours business is all about. And I've already got a hunter. I've talked about that already. So improving their equipment, their efficiency. So thermal equipment is just the number one. But experience, you've got to have experienced people. They've got to know their area, got to have the right attitude. So they know that they're there for a purpose, not just to fill their fridge, but they've got to have the right attitude. The hunters that we choose want to save their environment. It's a target female, cross-boundary control and selecting properties. Selecting properties is important Because if we get a controller onto a property and there's no deer, they're going to get frustrated and not want to do it anymore. And so we have to be selective about where we say, Mr. Jones wants deer culled on his property. You go there and there's hardly any evidence of deer and hardly anywhere that you're likely to be successful. Yep, I've been told I've got to wind up, so I've still got a lot to do. So I think I'll just move on past that one.
What is thermal equipment?
So thermal imaging equipment is you get monoculars and things that are able to pick up infrared light, and so they can see in the dark. So you can, you'll see, I'll show you a little bit about it in a minute. So we've done a bit of surveying, and I said early on that we need to understand our problem so that we know if we're being effective at controlling the problem. So we decided early on that we would do this. So we got funding for a survey. First we thought we'd get a helicopter and that was it, but then it was cheaper than we thought. And so we were able to also get a drone survey done. And this is our block. So the distance between there and there is around about 30 kilometres, and between there and there is about 20 kilometres. 110 hectares done. Preparation really is about letter dropping all the locals, because helicopters are really noisy and they work really low, and so we had to let everyone know that they were coming. But we got very, very little negative feedback about that. It was very pleasing. There were only about 2 people that complained, and so we just said, well, we'll just dodge around your property, and they were happy with that. The results in our area, so this is our valley. Bugger, sorry, excuse me. This is a Cardinia catchment, effectively, and so we wanted to find out how many deer we had, and as I said at the beginning, we didn't know that. The answer is 1,600 deer in our area at a density of 15 per square kilometre, which is huge. The cost of this survey was a really pleasing, I thought, $15,000. I thought it would be more than that. Because it's interesting, because we thought, well, maybe we should go with a drone survey. This is a bit of footage about what it looks like to a helicopter when it's going. This top little square here is your infrared that you were asking about. What does it do? So this picks up infrared signature. This is just a standard camera here. And you have to be quick, but you'll see the deer appear. Oh, deer in there, but you can't see them on the ground. I mean, you can if you look really carefully, and if you want to look later on, I can point them out to you on the ground. I wonder if we can do that back again. See if you can see them on the ground. They're there, you can see them moving, but it's hard. And you can understand now that it makes it so easy when you've got a thermal scope working for you. And the drone. So I don't know if you just go back a bit. You saw that with the helicopter, there's straight line surveys. So those white lines are the lines that the helicopter did. They do everything in a straight line, 500 metres apart, constant speed. They don't double back or anything. They just go on a transect, see what they see and make a note of it. That's the way they work. With a drone, this is the way he goes. So drone has to be line of sight. The guy's sitting on the dam wall here. This is a reservoir, and he could see all of that. And so he had his drone going backwards and forwards, every now and then doubling back because he thought he could see something. That doesn't happen with the helicopter. This is the sightings that he had down on the left here. That's where he picked up the deer. And in that particular property, which is only 1.6 square kilometres, 89 deer. But that costs $3,000. And if you look at the relative costs, this is helicopter versus drone. Helicopters rely on spooking deer because it's such dense canopy where we live. You need to actually see them moving because otherwise they might hide underneath the thick canopy. But when the helicopter comes along, they start to move and they can see them. Whereas with a drone, they don't want them to spook them. They want to actually go around and see underneath all the trees because they move so slow. And the relative cost. So per kilometre with a helicopter, per square kilometre was $136 versus drone was $2,300. So if you're doing big areas, it's helicopter every time. But that's a complicated thing, and if you want to discuss that with me later on, feel free to do so. Vegetation survey is another thing that we did. This was to try and find out how much damage was being done to our area now versus, how quick have I got to be?
Well,
Very quick.
I think we've
Okay, I won't talk about that survey. I will talk one thing though, just please. One thing, DeerScan. I know that some of you here are using DeerScan. DeerScan is a really valuable tool. It's citizen science for starts, very user-friendly, gives you quality data. Privacy is really important, so we don't like to publish the data about where the deer are. DECA don't accept it yet, but they're in discussion, so hopefully DeerScan information will be able to be imported to what used to be called DELP is now DECA. Won't bother going to iNaturalist, but what you see there, what you see there is what the average person can see. If you run a group, say for example, if your group had your own group within DeerScan and they report back to your group, then this is what you'll see. These are individual sightings within our area. And we keep this pretty private because we don't want hunters coming in. But the ones here, the darker it is, that's a lot of deer. Yellow is just a single deer sighting. The red ones are usually probably 6 or 7 or 8 or whatever. The little C's there, that's where deers have been culled. D is for deer damage, and I live there. That's my property. And we won't talk about the rest because we've run out of time, but these are the other monitoring techniques. Hey? Yeah, you can have the PowerPoint. As for you locally, there's been a history of deer here since 1984, but they're sporadic and elusive, but they're going to come. Sorry. Devil Bend, as I said, has got their program up and running. There are other deer in Tukaruk Swamp, hog deer, French Island Sandbar. This little footage here was taken in Greens Bush, where that red circle is down the bottom there. Just down there. So that's a local deer sighting for you. Yep. Yep. And what should we do now? So just reminding you that, oh bugger, excuse me, damn. Forget it. Just reminding you, you're at the very beginning of the invasion curve. Now's the time to do something about it. Thank you very much for your attention.